talk about ecosystem level interactions. Okay, so ecosystems are like communities because they're considering species interactions, but they also include the abiotic factors. So if you're talking about things on the ecosystem level, you're looking at more of a big picture. How does the system actually work? There are four basic components. They are the abiotic components, which are things like sunlight, air, water, nutrients, soils, geology, etc. Producers, which are things that are autotrophic and that are bringing in materials to the system. Consumers, which are consuming producers and or other consumers. And decomposers, which are breaking things down. Now, I'm being very simplistic about this food web or food design. I'll talk about that as we go through, but this is just kind of a generalization. So first thing we want to talk about is the idea of diversity. So diversity is the number of organisms in a in a community. So looking at this diagram here, you can kind of look at, let's see if I can get it in better focus. All right, so how about that? That's okay, I guess. All right, so this is community 1, and this is community 2. Notice that community 1 has the same type of species. They have A, B, C, and D. But in this case, the species are kind of spread out. In other words, they're about equal percentages within the community. So there's no one species that is dominant. Versus this community down here, where one species is a lot more dominant than the other species. So if you looked at this is more of a mono system, or a mono, not crop in this case, but mono species type of situation. So which one is more diverse? All right, so they both have the same actual numbers of different species, but this would be considered more diverse because they are more equally more equal percents of the different species there. There's no one species that's actually dominant. So that's something to consider when you're talking about ecosystems. All right. Another thing is food webs. Food webs, that is basically who's eating who, right? So a food web is just how are materials and things, abiotic factors moving into the system and being passed around. So I'll just back up so you can kind of stop this and take notes if you wanted to. So let's just talk about it though in the basic way. So the first thing that happens in a food web, in this food web that I drew, there's 4 trophic levels. So trophic levels are just eating levels. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's 4 trophic levels. On the first trophic level is where things are coming into the system. So this is where sunlight energy, or another energy source, but mostly in most terrestrial systems and actually most aquatic systems, sunlight energy is the energy source. Those are coming into the producer level. Producers are autotrophs, or things that are using that sunlight energy, things like plants and algae. And they are also going to be using nutrients from the soil or the water if it's a water ecosystem, and air, which is carbon dioxide in this case, but it could be later oxygen that's going in, and water if it's not a water ecosystem. Obviously they would need water to support the plants. All right, so those things are all going into the producer level. Primary consumers are things that eat producers. These are herbivores usually, but sometimes they might be omnivores, meaning they eat plant and animal. Things like squirrels, for example, are an omnivore. They eat primarily plant material, but every now and then they'll eat an insect. Insects can be plant users. That is, they use nectar from plants. Or sometimes they will attack, the soft tissues of plants, either fruits or actual leaves. So those can be in the primary consumer level. The secondary consumer eats primary consumers. So secondary consumers are either omnivores. In this case, though, they'd mostly be eating animal material, or they're carnivores, which are eating, other animals or other consumers. So all of them are eating other consumers, but omnivores may eat producers. So we'll talk about that in a second. So anyway, some examples of this that might eat a squirrel or snakes or might eat an insect or a frog. And then a tertiary consumer would be usually a carnivore, and that is something that is eating secondary consumers. Now, what we've left out of this is decomposers. Decomposers are going to be taking organisms that die from any level and breaking them down and returning them to nutrients in the soil. So there's what we call macro decomposers, things like vultures and ants, and beetles and things like that. And then there's micro, which are the bacteria and fungi. Those are, of course, in the soil and breaking things down and returning it back to the soil to be taken up by the producers. So this is what we call nutrient cycling, all right? So you might remember the nitrogen cycle that we talked about earlier in the semester. So an example, of nitrogen being passed through the food web in assimilation, and then through nitrification, denitrification, etc. in the soil would be passed back to nutrients in the soil and could be taken up by plants. So that's just an example of nutrient cycling. Okay, so a couple of things to talk about. One thing is I've done this as a food chain, right? But really it's a food web. That is things that are on this top level right here. The hawk might actually eat a squirrel, right? So this would be going up here. In this case, that would make the hawk then a secondary consumer. So hawks can be on a couple different levels, right? What about something like mosquitoes? Mosquitoes are eating blood, so they might eat blood from like a primary consumer, and then they would be maybe eaten by a secondary consumer. Some mosquitoes, though, eat, like the females, eat blood, but the males eat plant materials. So it's not always very clear, which is why they call it a food web. And if we were in a normal classroom setting, I would have you make one so you can kind of see the web nature. So anyway, another consequence, so we have the materials are passed through and cycled, so that's one thing. Another thing is, how does the energy move, all right? So the energy is decreasing as you go through the food web. And here, I just put some numbers here. They're ridiculous numbers, but I just put some numbers here just so we can kind of, sort of keep track here. So let's say most people say that about 1 to 2% of the sunlight energy is actually taken up by plants. That is 1 to 2% of the light that hits the earth. But still, these producers or plants are taking in the maximum amount of energy they can. So let's just say they took in 10,000 kilocalories of energy, which is ridiculously low. But generally speaking, they talk about the 10% rule. And what that means is the organisms will, on that level, on that trophic level, will use 90% and pass on 10% to the next level. That means that less energy is available for this level. Okay, so in this case, it would be 1,000 kilocalories being passed up here. Likewise, 10% rule here, that would mean 100. 10% rule here, that would be 10. All right, so the energy is decreasing as you go through the web. Does that mean that these organisms are less energetic? No, they're not actually, because they have to move around and get enough of these organisms to get the calories that they need. Likewise, these guys right here have to eat a whole lot of those to get the calories they need. These guys have to eat a whole lot of those to get the calories that they need. So what happens is something that we call biological magnification. Oh, have it in the wrong position here. All right, so what happens is let's say we have like a nutrient of some sort. We'll just say nitrogen because we were just talking about that. So let's say we have nitrogen, and the plants have just a little bit that they're taking up through the soil. But because the primary consumers have to eat a bunch of plants to maintain themselves, in this case I did just 3 just so I could draw it out, that means that they're concentrating that material. They have to eat a bunch of them, so this is a material that would be sequestered in their body. And likewise, these guys, then these secondary consumers have to eat a bunch of these. So they're going to be, you can see how the nutrient is going to be concentrated as you go up the food web. This is called biological magnification. Now there's a couple of things about this. It can only happen with a nutrient that can be sequestered. like calcium, magnesium, nitrogen, maybe. But mostly it's going to happen with things that are like in bones or things that are building the body. So it's not really going to happen with something that's ephemeral, but it does happen with carbon and, you know, calcium, magnesium, etc., those kinds of things. It also happens with things that are biological pollutants, like heavy metals. So this is why it's bad, probably, to eat from the top of the food web, because you're eating, if there's a pollutant available, like let's say mercury in fish, if you eat tuna, which is a top predator, then you're more likely to get a high level of mercury. All right, so that's just something called biological magnification. Okay, so another consequence of the 10% rule is that if you look, this is like energy as you're passing up. So there's more energy taken in here and less energy as you go up. And what that also means is that in terms of the number of organisms, there's a lot more on the bottom of the food web and less as you go up to the top of the food web. So we generally concentrate on the big things because they might be our predators, like we'd be interested in the hawk or the fox, maybe the snake, maybe the frog. But the thing is, we don't really concentrate on those nasty old plants. I know you guys love plants now after this class, right? All right, so, and then in the book they talk about cycling, like this is a water cycle, they have the nitrogen cycle, etc. But those all are related to the two major consequences. Energy goes down as you go through the food web, materials are concentrated and then cycled.